Thank you, Anne. Well done. Hi, Chicago. It's really great to be here. Thank you so much. And thank you, Anne. So I am going to talk today about preparing for climate change, as you just heard. And I think it's an opportune time to have this conversation because we're about a year away now from when Superstorm Sandy slammed into the East Coast. So that's very much on people's minds back in the East. And I have a picture of it, and there we go. I have it up for you now. So while Superstorm Sandy will be in the news again at the one-year anniversary later this month, I want to actually take you back to 2005, the year of the hurricane. And it was called that because there were so many hurricanes and tropical storms that year that we literally ran out of names in the alphabet that were chosen. So we had to go deep into the Greek alphabet with Hurricane Zeta, or Tropical Storm Zeta, very late in the season, actually after hurricane season. That year saw 7 major storms affecting the US. This one, for a time, was the largest that had ever been in the Gulf of Mexico. It had sustained winds, or at least gusts, of up to 235 miles per hour. And its approach to Louisiana, my home state, and Texas prompted the largest evacuation in history up till that time. And yet it still killed people in 4 states. Anybody want to say what they think it is? Which storm? It wasn't Katrina. Actually, if you look at the date, it was September. And so this, if you recall, was just 3 short weeks after Katrina. It was Hurricane Rita, which slammed into Texas and Louisiana not that long after Katrina had devastated New Orleans with 80% of the city underwater. And so the 1-2 punch that was Katrina and then Rita just weeks later caused over $100 billion worth of damage. And as you heard, my own family was affected by it, but we saw 2,000 people lose their lives in these storms. 300,000 homes were lost. These happened to be my mother's at the top in the Gentilly neighborhood of New Orleans. Although that's not her car, it was actually carried there by floodwaters that were up to the roof in this neighborhood, thanks to the London Street Canal break. And this is a middle-class neighborhood, very racially diverse, and some of the older people, frankly, did not make it out in time. Fortunately, she did, with the help of my sister and her husband, but that's their house at the bottom. They lived on Bel Air Drive, the first street in Lakeview, where the 17th Street Canal breached and famously pushed houses off their foundation. And so while they got out in time, they really did lose just about everything, as you can see from this picture. It was really heartbreaking. And when they arrived to live with me and my son in Arlington, Virginia, they actually had gas cans in the back of their car. Why? Because, as you'll recall, there were shortages, just like we saw with Sandy. Our reliance on fossil fuels and the fact that this punch, 1-2 punch, slammed into the infrastructure that we all rely on and actually caused a ripple effect throughout the economy that helped contribute to the global recession. Because, as you recall, 9 refineries were down, 100 drilling platforms, 500 pipelines damaged and destroyed in these 2 storms. But it wasn't just a one-time event. As you can see, just a couple of short years later, we had very similar paths for Hurricanes Gustav and Ike. And as we've seen with Sandy, it's not just where I'm from where this is happening. It's not just the Gulf Coast where we're seeing these mega storms. Sandy, Isaac down there last year, Lee, Irene before that, and on and on. And just as the science had predicted, we're seeing more of these superstorms. It's not necessarily true that we're seeing more hurricane activity in general, but when we do have hurricanes, they tend to be these supercharged, more devastating storms, more precipitation, more wind, because global warming is literally fueling these storms. It's sort of like, think of climate change putting these storms on steroids, if you will. And it's not also just these storms. We're seeing record numbers of extreme events. In 2011, the year of Irene, we had 14 $1 billion or more weather disasters, and that includes fires, floods, droughts, storms. This chart doesn't go through 2012 with Hurricane Sandy and the devastating drought that affected half of the counties in this country that were declared disaster areas in 2012. And it's not just the value of the property that's destroyed. Some of the skeptics like to point to that and say, well, people are investing more, homes are more expensive, people are living near the coast in unprecedented numbers. It's the absolute number of these events that are actually on the rise, and not just in our country, but around the world. And this can be distinguished from other events, like geophysical events, such as earthquakes. So you can literally see the traditional line, or the historic line of earthquake activity, but the ramping up of these mega storms, hydrological events, events that carry a lot of water, meteorological events like these storms. So much so that the Government Accounting Office in the US has now listed climate change as a top financial threat to the government. Why? Well, like we saw with the shutdown, the government owns a lot of land, parks, and property that's very much at risk. In addition, the government serves as an insurer. It insures crops, it insures for floods, and at the end of the day, it also does the disaster relief after these storms hit. But in a way, we're really all the insurers because according to the Center for American Progress, these disasters in recent years have cost each of our households $400 already. In addition to these extreme weather events that we predicted and in fact are now seeing already happening in our lifetime due to climate change, we're seeing sea level rise accelerating. And of course, this has dire consequences for those that live on the coast. Now, I know you're in Chicago, you don't live on the coast, but I'll tell you this, having family move in with me after Katrina, just thinking out loud here, I don't know, Chicago already is like a fabulous place to live, but just imagine how many people from the East Coast who are experiencing these amazingly horrible storms and this kind of sea level rise are looking at Chicago and the nice big freshwater lakes around and quality of life and thinking, yeah, maybe I'll show up at your doorstep. So while there has been some skepticism out there about climate change, about the movies about climate change and books, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you a reassuring lie, even though I think that would make us feel a lot better. So I am going to try to give you some examples today of what communities like yours are actually doing about it, and like my home state. So the I-10 twin spans had sections knocked out in Katrina, and it was rebuilt 21 feet higher to allow for greater storm surge. With 80% of the city underwater in Katrina, this is what the schools look like when the water receded. And the traditional way that we do disaster relief and funding of it in this country is we basically put people and infrastructure exactly back where they were. And the city of New Orleans actually took 5 years debating with first the Bush administration and then the Obama administration, saying, look, we don't even know that our whole population will come back. It hasn't. We don't know where it will come back. This happened on August 29th. The schools were just about to be in session. These kids got pulled out. The teachers are gone. So they wanted to have the money to invest where people were coming back. It took some years of negotiations. As you can see, the headline here is August of 2010. But they actually did get the formula to be worked out, so they figured out what it would have cost to put that infrastructure back in place. But they allowed them to build the schools where the people were coming back and in a more sustainable way, including my own elementary school, Hines Elementary School, which is much bigger and better now, but it just reopened last year. The way that people brought their own neighborhoods back was often just on their own and with volunteers from around the country, for which we'll be forever grateful. Beacons of Hope was started by a neighbor of my sister's in Lakeview, Denise Thornton, who figured out what it took to bring her own house back, worked with her neighbors to bring their community back, worked with people in my mom's Gentilly neighborhood, like this pastor, to bring that neighborhood back, and then, as you can see, even helped out in LaPlace after Hurricane Isaac just last year. And where people didn't come back, they actually started to use the vacant lots in innovative ways by contouring so that they would catch the water when they have these higher precipitation events. Not necessarily for a levee break like we saw, a catastrophic levee break in Katrina, but for more routine heavy rain events and storms. And so you can see the way that they're actually designing the green space that's left in New Orleans with climate change in mind, and actually putting some amenities like running paths near canals that catch the water. Irene was devastating to the inland state of Vermont, not a coastal state, and yet Vermont lost 300 bridges and 1,000 culverts like these that were either scoured out or blown out from the pressure of the water. And so a lot of towns were cut off, people were cut off from help for weeks. And yet, once again, Vermont has been in negotiations because our disaster relief spending favors putting culverts like the old one back in place, as opposed to these newer culverts that they were already putting in on their own, with a bigger design, broader, more sturdy, to allow not just for better water flow, but also for fish passage. So we have to figure out ways to incentivize changing our infrastructure with climate change in mind so that people aren't forced to put people and infrastructure back in harm's way that are frankly not going to last through the next storm. In Hurricane Sandy, of course, New York, New Jersey, a lot of places were devastated. There have been several commissions, blue ribbon commissions and panels. And in fact, even before then, there were estimates of what 3 meters of sea level rise would do to New York City. And that's what it looked like 5 years before Hurricane Sandy. And then when Hurricane Sandy happened, this is what happened to New York. That area is circled, and the surrounding areas. And you can see the similarity. I'll go back to that slide that predicted what New York would look like under sea level rise. So you can see that whether or not we have an intense storm, or if we just wait around a while, some of these places are going to be inundated. So New York is planning. They're planning ways to hold back the water. They're also planning ways to build our infrastructure with climate change in mind through land use and zoning and building code changes. And here you see some work of a task force that looked at having more green space to absorb the water. Also just realizing that these storm events are often, they often precipitate power outages. So making sure that people have operable windows, making sure that the backup equipment is elevated to higher floors, making sure that there's potable water in the building when the pumps don't work to pump it up to the people on the higher floors. These are some of the changes that New York is making with climate change in mind. Our work at the Georgetown Climate Center at Georgetown Law allows communities to think about how they need to change their policies and their ordinances with climate change in mind. What areas are necessary to protect because you just have such an investment in infrastructure and it's where most of your people and your businesses are, where you might be able to accommodate the water by elevating structures, or where it really makes sense to retreat because the water needs a place to go. And so this would allow for the migration of natural beaches and watersheds and wetlands. San Francisco's Treasure Island is one example of this. They're planning for climate change in the Bay by facilitating areas of dedicated open space, setbacks, elevated structures, and clustered high-density development, with also plans for what would happen with flooding and funding to allow for them to recover from that. This is how we traditionally hold back the water with these seawalls. But the problem with that is that once we have sea level rise or when we have these storms, then it will knock out whatever beach is left or whatever wetlands we have, and we'll have this barren wall around our country if this is the direction we go exclusively. And then we won't have habitat for our fisheries, and our quality of life really will not exist as we know it. And so states like Maryland are experimenting with these living shorelines that allow for these rocks and the green space to really absorb some of the wave action from the storm and allow these to migrate with sea level rise or with storms. But again, the Army Corps permitting process really favors the traditional hard armoring because they're used to that, whereas the states really have to negotiate, look at the individual circumstances of the individual landowner who wants to do something differently, and it can take up to 3 years. So these are the kind of obstacles that we're working to avoid. One of the most direct consequences of climate change and global warming, as you'd imagine, is heat. And you're already seeing the consequences here in Chicago with some lethal heat waves, back in 1995, for example. And here you see what a low emission scenario is, so you know what kind of heat is in store to plan for in 2040 and 2080. And what, if we don't curb our emissions, might happen all the way out in 2080. It's not necessarily a world that we'd want to live in. It has dramatic consequences for Illinois' climate. It will feel more like Tennessee or even Texas if we don't get our emissions under control. So clearly we can't adapt our way out of this. We also have to reduce our contribution to climate change. The city of Chicago is already taking action to do both of those things. They've had policies in place to encourage green roofs, white roofs. Here's the City Hall's green roof next to the former Cook County roof that was a tar roof, and the infrared picture shows a 77-degree temperature differential at the surface. But actually, I was really heartened to find when I went to the building yesterday that Cook County now has a white roof that's reflective, and they're doing much better, so there's this healthy competition here in Chicago. In Washington, D.C., where we work with the city, the D.C. Government is actually encouraging green roofs by sharing the cost of these new roofs with homeowners and building owners. They're actually recycling the 5-cent tax or fee on plastic bags and giving that back to some of the home and building owners that want to install these green roofs. And they have added benefits, not just to keep the building cool, the area cool, reduce urban heat island impacts, but also they absorb water, so they deal with stormwater runoff as well. And in addition to doing this kind of thing and working on their sustainability plan, they're actually, with the help of University of Michigan, mapping what the infrastructure looks like, where the areas are most vulnerable because they don't have this kind of green infrastructure, they have more concrete, and where vulnerable populations are from socioeconomic records of where the elderly live, where the poor live, where people with asthma are, for example. And then by looking at the information, they can actually target their outreach when there's heat waves, and they can target their investment in green infrastructure in the future. Philadelphia's had this neat contest, in addition to actually putting a cool roof ordinance in place, to try to get a whole block or more to go with white roofs. And it's neat because NASA is actually trying to measure what the heat island impact is for the area, and they're also measuring how much energy savings the people in these homes are realizing. And just recently, last week, the mayor announced, building on the already terrific leadership of Chicago, with new urban infrastructure designed at investing so that stormwater will not stay in your streets or go into people's basements, or there won't be combined sewer overflow problems, with a $50 million program to invest in capturing stormwater. And in the region, there's planning with adaptation in mind happening through this Great Lakes Adaptation Assessment for Cities. This is funded in part by Kresge Foundation, which is one of the regional foundations here that also supports our work with these communities, as does MacArthur, based right here in Chicago, and Rockefeller. And all of this information, other information, is available on our website. We have a clearinghouse, adaptationclearinghouse.org, where you can look at what the impacts might be. So in closing, I'd just like to say it's up to us to look at our own homes and our communities, our vulnerabilities and our exposures to risk, and to find ways to hopefully not just survive, but to thrive in a new normal, frankly. And hopefully these examples give you some hope that we can make investments that not only build resilience to climate change, but they also allow us to reduce our energy use, reduce our cost as a result of that, reduce our own contribution to climate change, and ultimately help with our quality of life on a day-to-day level. Thank you very much.